Thanks, first of all, for everyone coming along this morning. It's been a quiet week. This is obviously a pivotal moment in British politics. The last 24 hours have, I think, revealed the true character of Boris Johnson, and I think, as importantly, the real nature of his politics. It exposed in Johnson what can only be described as a really deep-seated, arrogant sense of entitlement. I think Johnson sees himself not as a modern-day Prime Minister whose authority rests upon parliamentary democracy. Instead, his actions betray that he's reverted to a much older tradition, a much older Tory tradition. I think he sees himself as a ruler, ruling over the ruled. Democratic practices like parliamentary votes have become to him just encumbrances to the freedom of the ruler. And you know, how dare the broadcast media even seek to pose questions and ask him for an interview or anything more than a short clip of him grinning? How dare the British media treat him in that way? It is extraordinary, the arrogance. And under this type of populism, spending reviews are no longer about long-term economic planning and management. They've become exercises in crude electioneering. They're charades based upon opinion poll politics. They're aimed not at rising to meet what is needed to invest in our public services or grow our economy or invest in our infrastructure, but they're about what will garner the greatest short-term electoral advantage for the Conservative Party. So this is what we've come to expect under Boris Johnson. Politics and government have become a series of cynical, manipulative, short-term electioneering stunts. And nobody's fooled. Nobody's fooled that this is a normal and proper spending review that any normal and strong and stable incoming government would undertake. It's a one-off, 1 year only, pre-election, panic-driven stunt budget. In a panic measure, as you know, Number 10 ordered Sajid Javid to cancel yesterday's major set-piece speech on the economy, and instead to bring forward his spending round to next Wednesday. This is obviously to be ready for a potential general election in October or November. And you know, it takes the whole exercise to a new level of political farce that they have the cheek to refer to the people's priorities in their latest press release. Look, as someone who from the very beginning and very early on was christened as the People's Chancellor, I can tell you that these stunt measures not only fail to address the people's real priorities, they demonstrate that the Tories have no appreciation of the people's pain imposed on them after year of Tory austerity policies. I think people see through this crude exercise as crude electioneering, ruthless opinion poll politics. It's straight out of the Linton Crosby election campaign handbook. It's where you take the top 3 or 4 issues that are prioritised in the opinion polls and throw as much and as little money and promises at them that will shift enough votes to get them into power. That's crudely why we've had a number of grandiose announcements from Boris Johnson throughout the last month on the NHS, on education and policing. And if nothing else, this has proved what we've said all the way along, that austerity was always a political choice and never an economic necessity. So for 9 years, balancing the books was pursued with a single-minded obsession by the Tories, no matter how much suffering it caused or how many economists said it was wrong and it would fail. It seemed from Boris Johnson's round of spending announcements throughout the summer that 9 years of austerity had all been for nothing, and we had a Prime Minister now prepared to borrow with abandon. Why was this? Was it the dawning reality of what benefit cuts mean to people on the poverty line? Was it the queues at the food banks, the thousands reported to have died unnecessarily in the past decade as a result of austerity? Or the new stories, shocking stories about homeless families forced to live in shipping containers in the fifth largest economy in the world? Had the Tory party suddenly decided to listen to the mainstream economic opinion, who for years have been saying that austerity is counterproductive? Or to the academics who linked, 120,000 excess deaths in the UK to the reduction in public spending by the Tories? Of course it wasn't. Of course it wasn't. It was a simple act of political opportunism. And yes, it was about the need to sugarcoat a no-deal Brexit, which would rip the heart out of our economy, to force through their fantasy of a chlorinated, chicken-pushing, NHS privatising transatlantic deal that Johnson seemed even prepared to admit 120,000 people died for no reason, sacrificed on the altar of conservative austerity ideology. But at least we got there, you might think. You might think. We've opposed cuts since the day they started. So the question is, shouldn't we be the first to celebrate a big spend budget? The problem is this, isn't it? That each spending announcement has soon been exposed as significantly less real money than the headlines proclaim. Just look at the NHS. Despite the Tory failure around the government's fanfare around the government's NHS announcement, it was soon reported that the majority of the new money for the NHS is not actually new money. It was exposed that at least £1 billion, the promised additional £1.8 billion, was not new money. The Nuffield Trust, I accurately described it as more like cash reward for delivering a surplus, the equivalent, I quote, of giving someone cash, then banning them from spending it, only to expect cheers of jubilation when later you decide they can spend it after all. On education, exactly as Jackie has said, the reports this morning of the reaction of school leaders to the leaked documents suggesting additional funding for schools, they demonstrate that this has been met with a deep scepticism. I just quote one head teacher. Heads will not be hoodwinked by large-sounding numbers that in fact merely cover rising costs in areas such as employer pensions and high pupil numbers. And he said, we're not mugs. Mary Bousted, the General Secretary of the National Education Union, made it clear that the money promised fell far short of what was really needed. And it just goes on. On policing, Boris Johnson, if you remember, promised, after their cuts of well over 20,000 police officers and police jobs, he promised 20,000 additional police officers on our streets. It was revealed soon after that a huge proportion of the new recruits won't be in the front line, and people won't be seeing the extra police officers on the streets they were promised. Police forces had petitioned the Home Office for extra numbers, with the National Crime Agency and other national forces requesting between 6,000 and 7,000 in total. That would reduce the number available to the Met and other police forces to around 13,000. Again, just another attempt at spin rather than reality of a spending review. And it's true, and exactly as Jackie said, whole areas of social need have been completely ignored, like child poverty, social care, or our justice system. And yes, local council services, because they don't often figure high in the opinion polls, and as a result, Johnson has ignored them in this cynical exercise. So far, we've heard nothing to assist local councils who are facing a £3 billion funding gap at the moment. Many local councils now have exhausted every form of creativity to try and bridge that gap and are now facing serious problems. Yes, even in Tory authorities. And there's been nothing so far announced to tackle the social care crisis. 1 million people without the social care that they need. And on prisons, we've also seen promises of up to £2.5 billion to be spent on creating 10,000 new prison places. If that sounds like a bold and radical new policy, you might want to compare it with the 2017 press release where the Justice Secretary Liz Truss announced the government's commitment to creating, yes, up to 10,000 new prison places. Or the press release 4 months after also announcing 10,000 new prison places. You might even remember the bold announcement and where it came from in the Conservative 2000 election manifesto. Since then, the Justice Committee has highlighted how little progress has been made, maybe because the Ministry of Justice was forced to raid its capital budget, switching hundreds of millions of pounds into day-to-day running costs instead. You know, it doesn't take long pulling at the strings of these so-called new announcements before they all start to unravel. And what's extraordinary as well is that Sajid Javid has announced that he's adhering to Philip Hammond's fiscal rule. So this is a fundamental admission that austerity is certainly not over, as they promised. So if austerity isn't actually on the ending austerity isn't actually on the government's agenda, what might we see instead? Well, the PM talked about raising the national insurance threshold. If it was brought into line with the income tax proposal allowance, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has estimated it could cost £17 billion. £17 billion a year. And who are the biggest beneficiaries? Those at the top of the income distribution in our country. And that comes on top of the income tax changes in the last 4 years that have benefited higher rate taxpayers 3 times as much as basic rate taxpayers. There's also been talk of cutting fuel duty, something which now we know the real cost of petrol to the taxpayer, who has to clean up the mess it causes. And it amounts to a huge subsidy to the fossil fuel industry and undermines, in reality, any commitment to tackling the climate change crisis we now face. This is money that could have been spent on incentivizing drivers to switch to electric vehicles or invested in improving the infrastructures to support that move. And you know, just as important as where the money is spent is how it's spent. With the rollout of broadband, will it be incentivized, for example, by taxpayer handouts to the Prime Minister's friends at Virgin and Sky? And will any new money for the NHS end up in the pockets of the US-based healthcare companies who are champing at the bit to get stuck into the UK's NHS service? If the Prime Minister and Chancellor were genuinely interested in ending austerity and changing Britain for the better, here's just some of the things we could expect in the spending review and budget. We might see them to commit, as we've done, to ending in-work poverty. We might see a real strategy to tackling homelessness or funding giving to mental health to ensure parity of esteem with physical health in the NHS. We might see the cuts to local government reversed, or significantly more money to further education colleges to invest in the skills people need after leaving school. Colleges which have seen their funding slashed by 1/5 since 2010. Or yes, the government stopping the universal credit rollout that's causing such misery and suffering and hardship to so many of our people. Of course, hanging over the spending round is the reality of the threat of a no-deal Brexit. Already, billions of pounds have been spent on preparations for a no-deal that could have been spent on our schools, our NHS, our policing services, on local councils. All these hard-pressed public services, denied the resources by this waste. And we have a Prime Minister who's been willing to vote through year after year of austerity, causing the deaths of thousands and misery for millions, then tear it up overnight if it might help him force through a no-deal Brexit that nobody voted for. Now, his friends in the newspaper editorial offices might fall for it, but make no mistake, we won't. In this coming week, we'll be scrutinising every pound of cuts to see if they're going to be reversed next year. And if the media are doing their job, they will too. To see whether, for example, the Sure Start centres are reopened, to see whether universal credit rollout is stopped, to see whether the social care crisis is ended, rather than just postponed with another short-term handout. Look, the The new Prime Minister seems to have dazzled some people with his boosterism and clowning. Look, if you enjoy clowns, my advice is go to the circus. Do not put them in number 10 in charge of our country. He tells us all to be more optimistic while labelling others as doomsters, those who don't fall for his routine. Calling people doomsters. Try telling that to the children. Try telling that to the children to be more optimistic. Those children who spent the summer scavenging for food in bins, according to the Childhood Trust, because they can't afford to eat without free school meals. Try telling it to those who are being housed in shipping containers due, according to the Children's Commissioner for England, to a shortage of affordable housing, cuts to universal credit and housing benefit freezes. Look, telling the truth about the poverty created by the Conservatives isn't running Britain down. And solving those problems won't come from crossing our fingers, hoping for the best, and trusting the Tories with our public services. The long-term future of our country will be determined in the next few months, potentially in an early general election. And I think just as Labour has won the argument against austerity, I believe we'll win the general election, committed to really ending austerity. Of course, Brexit will dominate some of that debate. But we must never allow it to blind us to what else is going on outside the Westminster bubble. Too many people's lives, too many people's lives and livelihoods are at stake for us to do that. This spending round also lasts for only 1 year and is a one-off. Our frontline public service professionals are making it clear that they need a level of long-term, stable funding that meets the needs of our community, not election gimmicks. Nobody's asking for a blank cheque, but what they fear under Johnson is that the spending round is a bouncing cheque, where 1 year pre-election spending promised lasts only as long as the election campaign, especially as the impact of no deal hits our economy. So at a time when the economy needs certainty and long-term planning, all the evidence points not to a serious spending round, but to an election stunt, inadequate and insecure, lasting as long as an election campaign only. So in the coming weeks, as we move towards what appears to be an inevitable general election, we'll be setting out our own policy programme to transform our country and the lives of our people. Just as in 2017, the Labour manifesto gave people a sense of hope, I'm sure that our new exciting programme will provide people with a genuine sense of optimism. We're looking forward to soon to be undertaking our own 5-year, long-term spending review in government. And it will comprise the greatest level of investment in our public services and physical and social infrastructure in the history of this country. Rest assured, you'll all be invited to that launch. Thanks for coming this morning.